The wind blew hard across the wide fields of Willow Creek Valley. The night was cold, and dark clouds covered the moon. Jonah Hale sat by the fire inside his small wooden house. He was a big man with strong arms and a quiet face. The sound of rain on the roof filled the empty room. Jonah lived alone and liked the silence. But tonight, something strange made him uneasy. Then came a small knock on his door. It was fast and shaky, like someone in great fear. Jonah stood up and opened it. There stood a little girl. Her hair was wet, her dress was torn, and her eyes were wide with tears. She looked no older than 7. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "They've beaten my mama. She is dying." Jonah's heart jumped inside his chest. He looked out into the dark, but saw no one else. The girl held a small blanket close to her chest. She was cold and shaking. Jonah knelt down to her level, trying to speak gently. "Who are you, child?" "My name is Ellie," she said. "Mama told me to run when the bad men came." Jonah felt a sting of anger mixed with sorrow. He had seen cruel men before. He picked her up in his arms and brought her inside. He wrapped her in a thick wool blanket and gave her warm milk from the stove. As she sat quietly by the fire, Jonah felt his chest tighten with old memories he wished to forget. He knew this was no small trouble. Somewhere near his ranch, a hurt woman lay fighting for her life. Jonah looked at the door and made his decision. Tonight, he would not ignore the cry for help. Jonah moved fast after Ellie told him where her mother was. The rain kept falling hard as he lit the lantern and saddled his horse. He lifted Ellie up and wrapped her safely in a blanket before setting her on the saddle. The little girl clung to him as the horse pushed through the muddy path. The wind was fierce, and the cold air bit their faces. Jonah's mind was full of worry. He did not know what kind of danger waited ahead, but he could not let fear stop him. They followed the narrow road that curved near the river. The sky flashed with lightning, and each flash showed them the shapes of broken trees and wet grass. Ellie pointed toward a small cabin at the bottom of the hill. Jonah saw a dim light through the cracks of the broken wall. He stopped his horse and carried Ellie down. When he opened the door, a weak sound came from inside. Mara lay on the floor, weak and barely breathing. Her clothes were torn and her face covered with bruises. Jonah knelt beside her and felt for a pulse. It was faint, but still there. He spoke softly to calm her. "It is all right. You are safe now." Mara's eyes opened for a short moment. She looked at him as if recognizing something in his face, then closed them again from pain and exhaustion. Jonah wrapped her in his coat and carried her out into the rain. He placed her on the horse and held both mother and child close. As they rode back toward the ranch, the storm began to quiet, but Jonah's heart beat faster. He knew his life was about to change in ways he could never have guessed. The morning after the storm was quiet. The sky was clear, and the air smelled fresh from the rain. Jonah had placed Mara in the small room at the back of his house. He had cleaned her wounds with care and wrapped them with clean cloth. Her face was pale but peaceful as she slept. Ellie sat beside her mother and held her hand, whispering small words that only a child could say. Jonah stood by the door and watched them. Something deep inside him began to feel warm again after many cold years of being alone. Every morning, Jonah started the day early, tending to his cattle and fixing broken fences. Ellie followed him around the ranch, asking questions about the animals and laughing when the horses shook their heads. Her laughter brought life back to the quiet place. When Mara was strong enough to sit up, she often watched through the window. Her eyes softened each time she heard Ellie laugh or heard Jonah's low voice talking kindly to her child. Soon Mara began to walk a little. She helped Jonah with small chores around the house. They did not talk much about that terrible night, but their silence carried an understanding that words could not reach. Jonah noticed her strength and courage. He saw a calmness in her that made his heart steady. At times, when the sun set behind the hills, Jonah would sit on the porch. Mara would bring him a cup of coffee, and Ellie would fall asleep on her mother's lap. The sound of crickets and the gentle light of the stars filled the night. For the first time in many years, Jonah felt peace. He did not know what the future held, but he knew he wanted to protect it. One quiet afternoon, The dust on the road began to rise under the hot sun. Jonah was working near the barn when he noticed 3 riders coming from the east. Their faces were rough and mean, and their clothes looked torn from travel. He felt the air grow tight around him. He knew in his heart that these were the men who had hurt Mara. He wiped his hands and stood tall. Waiting for them to reach the yard, Mara saw them from the window, and her face turned white. She ran outside and cried out for Jonah to be careful. Ellie held her mother's hand with fear. The leader of the men smiled in a cruel way and called out to Jonah. He said they had come for the woman and the girl, that they were his to take back. Jonah did not move. His voice was calm but strong when he answered that no one would harm them again. The men laughed and stepped closer. Jonah's dog growled but stayed by his side. The wind picked up dust from the ground as if the earth itself was angry. Jonah told the men to turn around and leave before they made another wrong move. One man reached for his weapon, but Jonah took one slow step forward. His eyes showed no fear. The men stopped. Something in his steady voice and his size made them think twice. After a long silence, they turned their horses around and left. The ranch stayed quiet for a while. Mara cried and fell into Jonah's arms. Ellie ran to hold them both. The 3 stood together under the open sky. The danger had passed, but something new had begun. Something strong and unspoken between their hearts. Spring came to Willow Creek Valley, bringing warm air and bright color to the fields. The grass grew tall and green, and wildflowers covered the hills. Jonah's ranch was no longer a quiet, lonely place. Every morning, the smell of bread baked by Mara filled the kitchen, and the sound of Ellie's laughter echoed across the yard. The house that once held only silence now felt alive. Jonah had built new fences and repaired the barn roof. Mara planted flowers by the porch and cared for the small garden behind the house. Ellie helped to feed the chickens and named each one of them. Jonah often watched them while he worked and felt something rare rise inside him. It was peace and warmth mixed with pride. He had known hardship all his life, but now he was learning what it meant to belong. The people in town started to talk about the rancher, who had faced 3 armed men and sent them away with only his words. When Jonah and Mara went to town for supplies, folks nodded with respect. Some smiled and greeted them kindly. The sheriff told Jonah he had done right to protect them and that the men had left the county for good. Mara thanked Jonah again for saving her and Ellie. Jonah said quietly that they had saved him as well. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch. The sky turned to orange and then soft purple as the sun went down behind the hills. Ellie would fall asleep with her head on her mother's lap, while Jonah and Mara watched the stars appear. Their hands would sometimes touch and stay there for a long moment without a word. They did not need to speak to understand what had grown between them. As summer came, the ranch looked full of life and promise. Jonah stood one morning by the fence, looking at the land that now felt more like home than ever before. Mara stepped beside him and smiled. In her eyes, he saw trust, hope, and love. Jonah knew that the night when the little girl had knocked on his door had changed everything. It had given him back his heart and his reason to live.